this video, we're going to learn about transclusion scope and how to pass data to transcluded content in a couple of ways. So the first thing, what exactly is transclusion scope? Imagine I have some markup in this fashion, which means the outermost div is associated with a controller called sample. It has got its own controller level message, and I have a directive called message, which is defined in this fashion. So which means I have a directive called message with its own template called message.html, which looks something like this. And I'm saying that transclude equal to true, which means the directive can have some transcluded content which can be injected right into this here, as because I have ng-transclude. So once AngularJS executes all of this stuff and gets it rendered, we are going to see the output something like this. Of course, do not worry about ng controller here or message, those are going to be out of scope, but just wanted to give some clarity here. So once rendered, this is what we are going to see as part of the browser. So which means I'm going to see some message from controller, this is the same message, and this is the message from the directive template, that is this guy, and the transcluded content which gets injected right after this, so that is inside this div. So we have all the content right here. So in that way, this is a rendered or the output of all of these three together. And now, where is the scope here? So we have the controller level scope, we have the directive level scope, and we also have the transclusion level of scope. So we have three levels of scopes here. And we pretty much know that the controller level scope usually will be available wherever the ng controller is defined. So which means the main controller level scope object will be made available throughout this surface. And now the directive scope. So whether you will be working with shared scope or inherited scope or isolated scope available as part of directive scope, it will be made available throughout this green area. And now as this is the transcluded content, it will have its own scope too. So every particular transcluded instance or transclusion instance will have its own transclusion scope associated with that. And best of all, it is automatically created by ng-transclude. So the moment you see ng-transclude, AngularJS framework knows that it needs to have its own transclusion scope object to be created, and it creates the moment it has been transcluded. So which means whenever this part, that is this message, the transclusion message or content, this particular content, whenever it is extracted and instantiated, we are going to have the transclusion scope also to be created and associated with that instance before even being injected as part of our template here. So before even injecting into the directive template, that particular transclusion scope gets created and gets associated with the instance of the transcluded content. And if you are using the clone linking function for each of those instances of those particular transclusion contents, we are going to have a separate transclusion scope created. So which means if we have multiple transclusion elements here, we are going to see multiple transclusion scopes, and that too if we are using the clone linking function as covered in my previous video. So now we are going to see on how the transclusion scope and the directive scope are related to each other. And of course, it is not just the directive, we are also considering the controller or the parent of the directive. So how are the scopes in all of these three categories related? And specifically, whenever we are talking about directive level, shared scope in this case. So let us consider I have the final output in this fashion, and we pretty much know that this entire div at the outermost level is nothing but the parent of this directive called message. So I have a directive message here, and the parent controller or the parent scope for this one is nothing but the controller scope. So the controller scope is currently made available in this fashion, and it is available throughout, and you can see it has got two members A and B with the values 10 and 20 respectively. And now I have directive level scope, and I've specifically mentioned it is shared scope. So shared scope means this is not going to have its own scope object. It is just going to use the direct parent scope itself as its own scope. So which means there is no special scope object available for this directive. It is the shared scope. It just uses or shares the parent scope, and which happens to be in this case it is controller scope. So now this directive has access to A and B directly. And now the transclusion. So this particular transcluded element is going to have its own transcluded scope. So which means there's going to be a new instance of the scope created specifically for the transclusion. So in this case, I already have one scope instance. For the transclusion alone, I'm going to have a new instance created. And this particular instance is actually inherited from the controller scope, or say the parent of the directive scope. So in this case, the parent of the directive scope is the controller scope, and the transclusion scope directly inherits from the parent of the current directive scope. And thus you have these members to be automatically made available here, as because those are inherited using the JavaScript prototypical inheritance. Okay, and there is one more thing we need to remember. Whenever a new scope has been created exclusively for the transclusion, and even though it is inherited, it is going to have a member called $parent, and this is actually going to refer to the parent of the current directive. So in this case, not the directive, but it is going to refer to something. So let us consider it is going to refer to something. So in this case, it actually refers directly the parent of the directive. So in the case of directive shared scope, it actually refers directly to the parent of the directive, which happened to be the controller scope. So even though the transclusion scope inherits from the parent, that is the controller scope, it still has a reference of this entire scope object directly in the form of $parent. So whether you use the current scope.a or current scope.$parent.a inside your particular transcluded content, you are still going to see the same output. So if you modify this, you are going to modify this. If you modify this, you are essentially modifying this as well. So that is the only difference. So in this case, again, you have the transcluded scope inherited from the parent scope, that is the controller scope, and still you have the reference of the parent scope in the form of $parent. Okay, now let us worry about directive inherited scope. As usual, I have the markup, I have the controller level scope, and I have the directive, and I mentioned directive as inherited scope, so which means it is going to have its own scope object. So the directive is going to have its own scope object. However, it is going to have the inheritance to be made directly from the parent element. In this case, it happened to be the controller scope. So this directive scope inherits from the controller scope, and thus it has got all the members directly from the parent scope. That is nothing but A and B. And yes, this is a scope on its own. It can have its own members as well, like C or D or E or F. So those members are particularly available only for this directive scope, but they are not accessible inside any of the parent. Okay, now again, our transclusion scope. So there is no difference from how this transclusion scope is derived. It still is derived from the parent of the directive. So that is nothing but the controller scope. Still it is inherited from this guy, and we are going to see A and B members made available because it is inherited in this fashion. But there is one difference. Now the transclusion scope is going to have the $parent referring to directive scope. So in the previous case, that is in the directive shared scope, the $parent is actually accessing this one. But in the case of directive inherited scope, the $parent is actually accessing the directive scope. So if you'd like to have the directive scope related members right in here, all you have to do is current scope, which is nothing but the transclusion scope, dot parent, that is $parent dot C, which means you can access these members right in here. And on top of that, the transclusion scope can also have its own members. So the transclusion scope can have the members from the parent of the directive or the directive or on its own. So we have all the three levels merged to be made available through the transclusion scope and could be applied throughout all the data binding for the transcluded content. And now the isolated scope. So you can see directive scope that is isolated. Still having the same markup. We have the controller with the member A and B, and I have the directive with an isolated scope. So whenever I say isolated scope, there is no relation between these two. whenever I say there is no relation, there is no direct relation like the inheritance. So this is not inherited from controller scope anymore. Even though this is a scope object on its own, it is not inherited from here, and thus these members are not going to be available here. However, it is going to have its own member called C, and it can have multiple other members, but these members are not immediately available here unless you use $parent here, which essentially has a direct connection to this controller scope here. So if you want to access A and B inside this, use $parent from here. And now coming to the transclusion scope in this case. Yes, the transclusion scope is still available. However, it is still inherited from the controller scope regardless. And as it is inherited, you are going to have A and B automatically made available. And even in this case, you have the $parent referring to the directive scope. So that is pretty important. So from the transclusion scope perspective, there is no difference on how you are going to access the members whenever you are using directive isolated or directive inherited. So $parent always refers to directive scope. And if you are using directive shared scope, which means the directive scope itself is the controller scope, so even the $parent will also be referring the same thing. So at any one moment, the transclusion scope can have the information from the directive scope using the $parent. However, if it is having other members, which means it has all the access to other members outside the directive scope from the parent scope of the directive, as because it is directly inherited from that scope. Okay, now that we have understanding about the relation between the transclusion, directive, and the controller scopes, it is also essential to know that a transclusion scope can also be custom scope, which means you can create your own scope object and send that scope directly to the transclusion or transcluded element and say that please use this, do not use your own, and please honor only this guy. Yes, it still can do that. And whenever you are doing that, you also have the option to provide some custom data. So you have this custom data option to be provided to a transclusion scope if and only if you use the clone linking function. So if you use clone linking function, you have access to transclusion scope object directly. So when you have this object, now you can actually add and provide as much information as you want in whatever the way you want it. And using the clone linking function, it is not just the transclusion scope. You also have the option to create your own custom scope object and send it across to your clone linking function. And all of this is nothing but you are having more options to provide very specific data to your transcluding content. Okay, let us have some examples on this one. So in this case, I have a pretty simple one like A01, which is having my A01.js, which is referring to this guy. I have a controller called sample, and you can see I have the same sample here. So let me add some JavaScript here. So as part of this JavaScript, first of all, I would like to have some content to be provided to the scope of the controller. So in this case, I would like to create an object A with a member X with a value 10. Okay, and now I would like to make sure that it is made available through my controller. So in this case, I would like to say that some better message. So I would like to call this one as this is controller, and I would like to have X equal to a.x. So let us make sure that it is made available through the controller. Yes, now you can see I still have this is controller X equal to 10. So I have access to X. Okay. Now let me create the directive. So I'm going to create a directive called app.directive, and I would like to call this one as message 1, and the function which actually returns on how this directive has to be behaving on its own. So I'm going to say it has to use a template which is defined inside message1.html. So I need to create that. So I'm going to call message1.html. Okay, and at the same time I would like to have the content of the message HTML also to be provided. So in this case, I would like to say div, and I'm going to say this is from template. So that is nothing but directive in this case. And I would like to have access to X here also. So which means you can see I'm trying to access a.x directly inside this template, which is available inside the directive. So let us see if this is working. Of course, I need to add that one right here. So let me have a new div to be created. And this div is supposed to be decorated with message 1. And I'm going to call this one as something like, I do not have any transclusion at the moment, so just wanted to make sure that this is working. So let us have this. And with no issues, we can still see that X is being made available. So let us see the IDs of these two. So I go in here, select this guy, and inside the controller, X is the scope object. And you can see the scope object currently is having the ID as 2, and it has got object A, which is nothing but having a member X. So let me go to the innermost content, that is our template. So this is the template. So let me clear everything, try to access it, and still you can see you are accessing the same parent related scope. So even though you are available inside the directive, so this directive template is still accessing the parent controller scope because it is currently the shared scope. So let us further enhance this with the transcluding content. So in order to provide the transcluding content, the first thing is that we need to mention like transclude equal to true. That's the first thing. And the second thing, where would the transcluded content go? So in this case, I wanted to mention something like ng transclude, and just to differentiate something between the template and the transcluded content. So all the transcluded content will be actually injected right here, so which means it will be blue color. So I did not provide any transcluding content, so I would like to provide some transcluded content here. So which is nothing but I wanted to say this is transcluded content, and I would like to have some kind of data binding here. I'm trying to access a.x. So you can see I'm trying to access a.x from the controller, a.x from the directive template, and a.x as the transcluded content inside the directive. So let us go back here and press F5. Yes, even the transcluded content has got access to X as well. So we have access to X everywhere. So let us see this guy and access the scope object of this one. And you can see the scope object is a bit different. It is ID 3. Let us go to this one. So that is the directive. And in the directive you can see ID 2. And if you see the controller level scope is having the ID as 2. So you can see the controller ID is 2. The controller scope ID is 2. The directive related scope ID is 2 because the directive is using the shared scope. And the third one, that is the transcluded content, is having its own scope, and that particular scope ID is currently 3, which is nothing but it has got its own scope object. However, if you see the prototype, you are going to see this scope object ID 3. The same object is actually inheriting from the scope object with ID 2, which is nothing but the controller related scope. So the scope object of the current transcluded element, that is the transclusion scope, is directly inheriting from the parent scope of the directive, which is nothing but the controller scope. And thus you have this A to be directly made available here. So there is no A here, as it is available in the prototype, which means it is available in the form of inheritance, and thus it is made available here. And if you look into the parent object, $parent, this is also referring to ID2. So in both cases you still are referring to the same parent object as I mentioned in the slide. So you can see this is going to have the inheritance from the parent object. So this is a scope object, this is a scope object. So this is a scope object with ID2, this is the scope object with ID 3, this is inheriting from this one, and the parent is also still referring to the same thing. So that is pretty much whatever you have as part of the shared scope. And let us consider you would like to add something inside the controller scope here. So this is directive level controller, and I can still access something. So I can access all of this information, and this scope currently, as is shared, you are essentially accessing the same controller scope right in here. So now I can modify this. So I can say I would like to have a new object B to be assigned to the scope, and I would like to have Y to be made available. So along with scope.A, you also have scope.B made available through the controller scope. Why it is controller scope? Because Directive uses shared scope. So this $scope currently refers to the controller, as because this is currently shared scope. That is pretty important. Okay, and now let us consider I would like to access Y right here, and in fact right everywhere. So b.y. So let me use the same thing, and even here. So let me save this, and let me call with this one, that is shared scope. So let me put something like that. And now you should be able to see, okay, I missed something here for this one, so I did not save this file. So let me save this. Yeah, press F5, and now you should be able to see X and Y made available through all the levels. So even though the controller level scope is provided with ID 2, you can see still B is made available because you are modifying or adding B in the directive, which essentially adds the same member to the controller scope. So even though you are not adding here, it is the scope object is being modified somewhere else, and that is how you got this particular value out. Okay, so this is pretty much about shared scope. And now let us consider how the inherited scope will be working. So I go to the inherited scope. So let me copy this whole thing. And I would like to call this one as message 2. Still using the same. However, there is one difference. If you want this one to be an inherited scope, I have to call this one as scope equal to true. So the moment I say scope equal to true, this directive becomes uses the inherited scope. So whenever I say inherited scope, if you see the second slide, the directive will have its own scope object. So which means this ID, and this ID, all the three will be different. However, this will be having a prototype from this one. This will also have a prototype from this one. And this parent has to refer to this scope of this ID. So let us see all of those together. Okay, so this is inherited scope, and I'm still having everything here. So let me go back here. And I just wanted to comment this, so that we will have a better understanding on what we are trying to accomplish here. And I would like to use message 2 here. That's it. So let us try press F5. Okay, there are a couple of differences. If you see here, you can see I do not have Y here, but the directive level I have X and Y, and the transclusion level I do not have Y either. So let us see the IDs one by one. So let us go to the controller level scope. Yes, this is the controller level scope. Let us see the ID of this guy. And you can see ID is 2, and it has got only A, and there is no B available. Because even though there is a B, this B is actually working with the scope of the message. So that is at the directive level. So the directive level has got its own scope object. And to prove that, let us directly go to the directive level. So this is the directive level. So let me clear everything. And if you open this, so you can see there is a different ID here. This is not parent scope anymore. This is a different scope with its own ID called 3. And this scope is having an object called B. However, this scope object is actually inheriting through the prototypical inheritance of JavaScript from the parent scope called ID2, which is nothing but the controller scope. So the controller scope has got A and the current scope has got B, and thus you have both A.x and B.y being rendered successfully with no issues. And if you see the parent of this guy also, see, you still have the parent of the current scope of the directive to be still working with the controller scope. So that is pretty important. Okay, and now let us further dig into our transclusion scope. So let me clear everything. And by definition, the transclusion scope will have its own object. So if you see, it has got ID 4. Let us see the prototype. And now you can see from the prototype, it is still inheriting from the controller scope, so ID 2. And thus you have A access. So that's the reason A.x is working, no issues. You do not have B here. And neither it has a B here. So there is no B object available to this scope, that is to the transclusion scope. And thus B.y is not going to be found, and there is no value for that one either here. But as I mentioned in my presentation, this has got a reference of the directive scope using $parent. So let us go back to our browser, and if you see the parent, you can see I am having the reference to the directive scope ID 3, and thus it has got B here. So you have the transclusion scope ID as 4. It is referring to the parent called directive scope with ID 3, and the transclusion scope is inheriting from the controller scope with ID 2. So you have A, you have also B, provided if you use $parent. If not, it's not going to be found, and it can have its own members. So in order to fix this Y here for the transcluded element, I have to say $parent .b.y. So let us see if this is working. And thus you can see it is working with no issues. So that is how you can access the members available inside the parent of the directive through the transclusion scope. Okay, and now as we have completed this inherited scope, let us have the isolated scope. And I would like to call this one as 3. And just for our understanding, let us remove this. And I need to create a new directive for this one and call that one as 3. And I would like to call this one as isolated scope. And an isolated scope can be easily created with just a brace or an empty object here. And an isolated scope here is going to have its own member called B, and see how we can access all of that great stuff here. So I still have all of the same with no differences, and press F5. And now there is a difference. Of course, Y is not going to be available here because it is available at the directive scope and not at the controller scope, which is fine. But from the directive scope, you can see the X is missing because this directive scope is not inheriting from controller anymore. There is no relation between these two directly. So if you go back to my approach here, you can see in the inherited one, you have the inheritance. But in the isolated, there is no inheritance. And thus, whatever you have here are not going to be available here. So you do not have access to controller scope inside your directive. And thus you cannot have the value of X anymore. However, you still have the access to Y because the scope itself has got Y. So if you go back here, you can see my isolated scope has got its own B.y, and that is being successfully honored here with no issues. So let us check the IDs. So this is controller level scope. This is ID 2, no issues. I go back to directive level. So inside the directive level, you can see this is a different ID, which means this is different scope object. And let us see the prototype. And this prototype is not having any ID, so which means it's not a scope object here. This prototype is not a scope object. And thus it is not having object A anymore, so you do not have A.x at all. But it indeed has B because we created the B object directly for the directive object, so that is directive scope object, and thus B.y is available. So if you would like to access still the parent level member inside the directive here, you still have access to parent, and inside the parent you have ID, and thus you have A. So if you would like to have from the directive level here, you have to say something like $parent.b. So this is from the directive. So I go in here. Oh, sorry, I did the other way around. So I have to use $parent here. So I'm trying to access $parent.a.x, and b.y is available in the current directive. So I press F5 and we should be able to still access x and y directly. And y for this one is not still available. So let me go back here and let us see the scope of this guy. Yes, it is having a different scope ID as 4. No A or no B available. Let us see the prototype. So it is inheriting from the controller scope. It has got access to A, and thus A.x is working. Let us go to the parent. And now the parent is actually going to ID 3, which is nothing but the directive scope. And inside the directive scope I have B. So in order to access this B, I have to write $parent. So I go back here, I go in here, and in order to access B, I have to write $parent.b.y. and let us see if that fixes our issue. And there you go. So you have accessing the members from the controller, from the directive, all the way to the transcluded content in whatever the way you want it. Okay, so this is pretty much about isolated scope. I just wanted to get back, and let me get back to the previous one. I do not want this anymore here, just for our understanding. So now that we have completed the relation between the transclusion scope, the directive scope, and the controller scope, now is the time to understand on how the transclusion scope related data can be modified. So in order for that to happen, we need to work with the clone linking function. So let me create a new directive for that one. So I would like to call this one as custom data to transclusion scope. And I would like to call this one as message 4. And I would like to use a different template. The reason is that I do not want to use ng-transclude anymore. I don't want to use this because I'm going to use our clone linking function. I do not need ng-transclude because I control the transclusion on my own. So I need a duplicate of this one. So I call that one as msg2. And let me close this message 1 for our understanding. And the message 2, all is that I am going to remove this guy, and I'm going to say ID equal to something like inner panel, so that I access this inner panel directly in my JavaScript and then inject the transclude element right here using the clone linking function. And all of that is going to happen right here in the message 4. So in the controller, I create scope object P with no issues. So let me close this. And the first thing, I need to have access to transclude function. So I ask AngularJS to give me the transclude function here. So I'm going to use the transclude function in the form of clone linking function. So which essentially will give me trans element. And now I can say this particular element is nothing but this content. So the instance of this content is made available through this $element. So I use that dot find, and I'm trying to get this div. So I use that div, and I am going to say append this guy. That's it. However, we are not still sending the custom data here. So we still need to send the custom data. For now, we are not sending the custom data yet, but we're just using the transclude function instead of ng-transclude, which we used earlier. So we are not using this anymore. We removed that, and instead we are using the transclude function here in order to dynamically extract the transcluded content and then inject right into the place wherever we would want it. And now I need to have message 4 currently I just wanted to say transcluded, so I can just say manually transcluded scope. Okay, so for the manually transcluded, I can still have the data to be made available in this fashion. So let us see how this one works first. So I just wanted to call this one as something like manually transcluded. Okay, so what is this? This is message 4. Okay, did I modify this? Yes, I need to modify this one to message 4 here. So I have the message 4, and this is referring to message 2, and this is still isolated scope. So I go back here and press F5. Okay, so this is from template directive X. We do not have X, and of course we need to have the transcluded element. So this is message 4. For some reason this one is not coming out, so let us see what's going on. So I have the inner panel, so I missed this guy, so I need to access it using the jQuery selector, the ID selector. So I press F5 here, and now you should be able to see the same thing as you did earlier. So I still need to access the $parent if we really wanted to access the directive level scope. So but our goal is to really send some custom data inside. So I would like to send some custom data. So in order to have some kind of custom data, this particular transclude function, that is the clone linking function in this case, can actually give you the transclusion scope object directly. So whatever the scope object you are binding to this transcluded content, that particular scope object is going to be made available through this one. So that is important. So using that we can actually get it. And there's one more thing. Even though I use $.parent b.y, you can see I'm not getting it here. So let us see what's going on. So I go in here and I open this, and let me get the scope element out of it, and you can see ID 4, and let me see the parent. So parent currently is actually $ID2, so it is not the directive scope anymore. It is actually the controller scope, and thus you do not have it. So the parent is not going to work here. And if you open the prototype, it is still the parent too. So you are not going to have the access to your particular directive using this manual way. And the other way around is actually to use this transclusion scope element to send your particular data. So I can say the transclusion scope element. So what is this object? This object is nothing but what you are actually seeing it here. So this is the object. So whatever the scope object which is currently associated with this transclusion element, transcluded element, that scope object is nothing but the one which is going to be available here. And now you are saying that this B can have its own object, and I am going to say b.y equals $scope.b.y. So you can say I'm using the $scope.b.y to be made available through the transclusion scope, and finally made it available through this one. So if I am using this, I don't need parent anymore, and it should still work fine with no issues. And there you go. So this is how you can send some custom data to your transcluded element whenever you really need to work with your transclusion scope. Okay, so the next thing is that we need to have our own custom transclusion scope to be created. So which means in all of the above scenarios, we are not creating the transclusion scope. The transclusion scope is actually created by the AngularJS framework. But in our case, we really need to have our own transclusion scope to be created as a separate case. So for that purpose, I would like to create a new directive. So I'm going to say this one as custom transclusion scope, and I would like to call this one as message 5. And after this message 5, okay, so I'm still going to use message 2, transclude equal to true, scope is fine, and this scope is also fine. And as part of this one, so let me remove all of this. So I would like to create a new scope on my own. So for that purpose, I can just say some custom scope. You can provide your own variable, whatever the variable you want here. Using any scope object, use $new, and I can say true. So whenever I say this, which means essentially you are trying to create a new scope object, and that to an isolated scope object here. The moment you say true, you would like to have a new isolated object to be created, an isolated scope object to be created from the current scope. So that is how you are trying to create. So this is the custom scope object, and you can provide your own custom values for that one. So I can say custom scope can have its own A with its own X, and similarly it can have its own custom B with its own custom Y and with its own value 200. And now I can use our clone linking function, which is our transclude. So this is the transclude, that's nothing but this function, and transclude with my custom scope. So I can just send this variable as the first parameter, and then my callback function, which essentially gives the trans element. So this function is nothing but the callback function which we used here. So this is nothing but the function we are using there. So now I can just use this one in order to have our particular transcluded element to be actually appended into the inner panel, but it has to associate, the entire transcluded content needs to be associated with this scope whatever I'm sending. So in that way, the values of the X and Y for this transcluded element alone will be different from the others. So I need to create 5 here. So I'm going to comment this one, and I'm going to say custom transcluded scope, and I just wanted to say 5 here. So I go back here, press F5, and now you can see I have X value as 100 and Y value as 200. So if you go in here and click on here, let us see how the scope really has information in it. So it is still having a different object. So that is the scope object whatever you created. Let us see about the prototype. The prototype is not really being inherited from anywhere else. So you are not inheriting, the transclusion scope currently is not being inherited from any of the parents. And let us see what is parent. So the parent is still ID3, which means you're still having access to your directive here. Why? Because you are creating from the scope of the directive. So if you go in here, this is the directive scope. So as you are using the directive scope, you are having that parent there. And if you go back here, and if you open this one, you still have access to B. That B's value of Y is 20, but that is not you are accessing here, as because you created your own members A and B with their internal members as X and Y with values 100 and 200 respectively. And that is how you can have your own custom transclusion scope to be created and sent it across. And on top of that, you can have your own custom data to be set to the custom scope and send it across. So we have almost all the scenarios to be covered as part of the transclusion scope, which includes the relations between the controller, directive, transclusion scope, and the custom scope and the custom data.